of domestic violence on kids. And oh, there we go. Sorry, I was having a minute having a hard time getting my slides to progress. So just a little bit about the WCA, which is the organization that I get to work for. So our mission is to provide safety, healing, and freedom from domestic abuse and sexual assaults. And our vision is to foster a community where individuals thrive in safe and healthy relationships. Okay, and some of the services we offer many, many different services. I'm not going to go into all of those. The only one that I wanted to speak about just really briefly was the one with the asterisk next to it, play therapy, because that is something that I am involved in and what I offer for clients. So a bit about our agenda this morning. We're going to be talking about the effects of domestic violence on kids, the impact of domestic violence on the developing brains of children, the impact of attachment and parent-child relationships, protective parenting within the context of domestic violence, and what can help trying to just mitigate the effects of domestic violence on kids and their families. So part of the purpose for why I wanted to start with the meditation this morning was just really kind of coming from that idea of, putting on your own oxygen mask first and taking care of yourself, because I think it'll make a bit more sense later on as we go through the slides, but it's so important to be able to, for you as an adult working with kids, be in a calm, regulated, present state when you're dealing with kids who may be in a more elevated state. So really like taking care of yourself first before taking care of others. So getting into more about the effects of domestic violence. So we can really think about the impact of kids in terms of how are they affected by domestic violence? So for sure, when they hear or see harmful actions by abusers, they might be directly witnessing these types of experiences. They might also directly experience physical assault themselves, like they may have their own injuries from domestic violence. Sometimes kids might experience more of like the aftermath of an incident, perhaps like mom and dad were fighting and they weren't there, or maybe they were in the other room, but they see kind of the aftermath of it. It could be something like injuries to mom, maybe mom has a black eye or other bruises or harm. There might be a hole in the wall or other damage to the home. Sometimes pets are hurt, and so they might see injuries to the pets after all of this. Middle of the incident, like perhaps mom is holding an infant when she experiences abuse. Again, maybe kids are clinging to their mom while she's trying to get away. Maybe a teenager stands up for the parent and then gets hit instead. Maybe the abusive parent throws dinner, but it ends up hitting the kids. So there could be all kinds of ways where kids are kind of put in the middle of an incident. And then a last piece that I see quite often too is that there's abuse that continues to occur even after the parent has left the abuser. I think some people might think that, oh yay, like the parent has left the abuser, like everything is fine and good and the kids are safe. But in a lot of ways, post-separation abuse will continue to happen, perhaps throughout the kids' lives until they turn 18. That's really super common, unfortunately. I just realized too, Monday at 7:30 after daylight savings, my brain's a little foggy. I forgot to give just a disclaimer in terms of, we'll be talking about trauma. We're going to be talking about just really difficult things. So please just take care of yourself. If any of this is really difficult for you to be listening to or hearing, or maybe brings up your own experiences of trauma, please know that you can take a step away. You're not by any means required to stay here and sit through content that might be really difficult, especially since I know you're just starting your work day and that might be really challenging. So please just take care of yourselves as best that you can as we're going through these slides. Let's see. So a little bit more about the prevalence of domestic violence. So it's thought that more than 25% of US children have witnessed domestic violence. So that's a pretty high number. You could think about it maybe as like 1 in 4 kids. So just trying to define trauma a little bit more. So a trauma is a psychologically distressing event that is outside the range of usual human experience. Trauma often involves a sense of fear, terror, and helplessness. So I think from that working definition, we could pretty safely say that domestic violence or experiencing these really scary events could very well be traumatic to children. Some different symptoms of trauma that you might see as educators and children. One piece I just wanted to say was that often other disorders can kind of look like trauma, for example, ADHD or autism. And my next slide will talk about that a little bit more. But some other things might be just having a really difficult time focusing. I'm sure you probably see that a ton in school. Having language delays, difficulty connecting with peers. I think so often trauma occurs in the context of human relationship, right? Like it's a parent who's hurting another parent. And so it can make it really difficult to navigate those, normal human relationships of not knowing like who's a safe person, who can I trust outside in the world. Some other things you might see might be explosive or defiant behavior. I think the defiance is super common too, in terms of, if a kid feels a really serious lack of control at home or feeling like things are happening that are beyond their realm of control, they might be exerting a lot of defiance in other areas of their life because they're sort of like stomping their foot down and saying like, I might not be able to control this, but I am sure as heck going to be controlling this situation. Isolation is really common as well. And in some ways too, I often feel really concerned for those kids who are like the quiet, like withdrawn. They might be really well performing in school. Like they might get straight A's, but they're just like really quiet and like keeping to themselves, because a lot of times like you like with the defiant kids, it's very externalized, what's going on, but some of those like quieter kids who are just internalizing it all, like they're not really showing their colors, and it's harder to know really what's going on inside in their like inner world. Self-harm or risk-taking behavior, another symptom. This is the diagram I really love to share with parents too, because you can really see in this how there are some major overlaps between an ADHD diagnosis or a trauma, PTSD type diagnosis, in terms of like those difficulties concentrating in school, kind of checked out, maybe doesn't seem to listen, disorganized, hyperactive, restless, like all of those things are so similar in both cases. But this is where it's so important that we get the proper diagnosis. And if it's a trauma diagnosis, we're going that way, because either way, treatment is going to look very, very different depending on whatever you land on. And often too, if it's a trauma, a true trauma situation, but then they've been misdiagnosed with ADHD, most likely they're also taking meds for ADHD, which can really exacerbate some of the symptoms of trauma. So it's super important to really get down to the nuts and bolts of what's actually going on for the kid. A little bit more on the symptoms, having just a really hard time with emotions and not being able to regulate emotions. Just having a high fear response. This might even come about like looking like hyperarousal, like kids are just like kind of always on the edge and kind of scanning their environment and keeping in touch with, the possibility of danger. Having regressive behavior, so maybe kids who were once toilet trained, having accidents again, increased sensitivity to stimuli. So this might be kind of like a startle response, like a loud sound happens and kids startle easily. Somatic complaints, so this could look like stomach aches or headaches that don't seem to have a medical underlying reason. Changes in eating or sleeping habits. This could look like a lot of nightmares at night, and then just changes in weight, like gain or loss both. And that's, connected to also the changes in eating habits as well. So I think some really, really helpful things to keep in mind here too, is that, trauma isn't just something that happens in your head, or it's not just a memory, but what a lot of the current research is showing is that kids who have experienced trauma actually have a different brain anatomy than typical children. We're kind of in that just decade of the brain where we're learning so much about the brain. We're able to scan the brain and see different regions of the brain and understand more about them. And a lot of the brain scans have shown that kids who have experienced trauma have a really hyperactive amygdala part of their brain, which is like the amygdala is kind of like your fire alarm in your brain. Like it's constantly scanning for fire or scanning for danger. And so kids who have experienced trauma have a really active amygdala, and more so than a typical child. We'll talk more about the ACEs study, but there's also health impacts of trauma as well, and that the more traumatic experiences children may have, the more likely it is that they'll have negative health outcomes like obesity, heart disease, cancer, asthma. The other really interesting thing that's been studied is in epigenetics. And so that's looking at how ancestors, like it could be Holocaust survivors or Native Americans, can pass down a different genetic code to their children based on their traumatic experiences. So there's definitely this like ancestral trauma piece to it as well. So I wanted to just give out a poll, which Tracy will help me with this, but I just wanted to ask, what would you think? Are pre-verbal children remembering less, and so therefore they're less impacted by domestic violence than their older siblings? Okay, looks, at least on my end, I'm seeing a lot of results coming in for one answer in particular. Okay. Let's see, it looks like about half of you all have voted. Let's just give it another minute or two to give everybody a chance to vote. Okay. Let's see, looks like most of you have voted. So I'll go ahead and end the poll. Let's see. Okay, I'm gonna share what you all voted. So it looks like most people, 90%, all thought that the answer was false, and then 10% thought that it was true. So I'm not gonna tell the answer one way or another just yet, because I have a video I wanted to share that I think will help give a really good explanation of that question. So give me 1 second. Oh, I think I have to actually, I need to do a stop share, then I need to go back and reshare. Yes, okay. Oh, and I need to share sound. Okay. All right, here it goes.
Because of the way the brain works, you will always remember your very first roller coaster ride. Storing these new experiences is one of the brain's main jobs. In fact, your brain creates a mental blueprint of every new experience you have. A blueprint for any new touch is stored in one part of the brain. A blueprint for any new sound in a different part. And a blueprint for any new sight in still another part. But as powerful as that first roller coaster ride was, it can't compete with the lingering effects of your brain's earliest experiences. Although you have no conscious memory of this part of your childhood, it is these very first experiences that literally become the building blocks for your whole life.
Unlike other organs, the brain is undeveloped at birth, and it is waiting for experiences to shape how it will develop. The amazing thing about the human brain is that the younger you are, the more sponge-like your brain is, which is the reason that children in 3 years can learn language, can learn to walk, can do all kinds of incredible things. But the very same biological sponginess that allows us to rapidly acquire language is also the same sponginess that makes young children more vulnerable to trauma than older children.
We have the opportunity to do police ride-alongs to a domestic violence situation, and so this was actually the first call I ever rode along. It was dinner time, and they were having spaghetti for dinner. It was dripping down the walls, the kitchen table was overturned, and we had 3 children in the household. Looking at this whole situation at the time, we said, no evidence of physical harm, the kids are fine. We learned differently, of course. The boy in the corner was classic behavior that we see with kids who have had chronic exposure to violence. He would just completely zone out, numb out as things started to get scary. The 6-year-old little girl on the chair blames herself for what's going on, but actually it was 4 years later that we really appreciated who had some of the most profound or severe harm coming out of this situation, and that was the 6-month-old baby who was now 4.5 and had seriously injured another child in preschool.
It's literally the opposite of the way most people think about this. Most people think young children, they don't really understand what's going on and they're resilient. But the fact is, if anybody's impacted more severely, it's the younger child.
The brain is put together like building blocks in a sense. Those first blocks that go together are the more primitive area, the survival brain.
The brain develops from the bottom to the top and from the inside out, so that the normal development of the top part of the brain depends upon healthy development of lower parts of the brain. The top part of the brain, where you do all of your thinking, is the part of the brain that is most changeable, easiest to modify. But unfortunately, if a child has developmental experiences of threat and exposure to domestic violence, the lower parts of the brain will be impacted and they're harder to change as they get older.
He was never physically abusive, but he was verbally abusive. There was lots and lots of screaming in front of the kids, berating, putting me down. And
Okay, I'm actually gonna just stop the video right there. And I'm gonna put the link into our chat just because I think it's another 10 minutes long and it's a really awesome video. So I want, if you guys want to keep watching it, then there you go. Bruce Perry is just a really fantastic resource for all things children and trauma. So I would definitely recommend anything that he writes as well. Okay, so I'm gonna go back to sharing the slides. Okay, and then present mode. Okay, perfect. So I think just through that video, I think we could probably go back to our poll and say that for sure children in that age frame of 0 to 3 are more impacted by trauma or by domestic violence than older children, just due to that like sponge-like nature of their brains and just how much they're able to grow and develop in such a short amount of time. Okay, so I wanted to talk just a little bit about our brain and just using Dan Siegel's brain model. So you might know about him already, but he talks about how you could think of our brain as being like a handy model. So meaning like this part of our, like where our forearm is, this is like our brain stem and then our spinal cord. You could think of your thumb as being sort of like that amygdala that I talked about a little bit earlier. That's like the fire alarm part of the brain going like, am I safe? Am I okay? Am I in danger? Is there anything I need to activate, fight, flight, freeze to escape from? And then this part of the brain, you could think of this as being like our executive part of our brain, our prefrontal cortex. And so when the prefrontal cortex is online, it's able to sort of like soothe the amygdala in some ways. It's able to say, okay, like I can think through things, I can problem solve, I can rationalize, I can plan ahead. But once we're in a state where, you know, let's say like a tiger or something walked into the room right now, you might think of like the prefrontal cortex is going online and the amygdala starts running the show at that point, where we're then just automatically activating, are we going to fight this tiger? Are we going to freeze and pretend like we're dead? Or are we going to run away from the tiger? So all of that is going to happen like automatically in those cases. So a little bit more about healthy attachment. So I just mentioned earlier that we were going to talk a little bit about how domestic violence impacts healthy attachment. So some of what Perry talks about is that healthy attachment has 3 really important components. So it involves an enduring emotional relationship with a specific person. And this relationship brings safety, comfort, soothing, and pleasure. And a loss or a threat of loss of this caretaker person evokes really intense distress. So you could really think about early attachment as being all about survival. Like the child really needs to know that when he or she has a need, that need will be met. Or when the child is experiencing some form of distress, that the parent will intervene and help to calm them down. So you could really think about some important pieces about attachment in terms of physical touch being super, super important and critical to forming this healthy relationship in terms of, you know, if a child has experienced some distress, the parent isn't going to come in and say, okay, kid, remember like to use your healthy coping skills, like do some deep breathing or, you know, practice what you know. No, like rather the parent is going to come in and they're going to pick up the kid and they're going to rock them and hold them and use all of these kind of like physical movements to help bring soothing to that child. And that's where like rocking and some of that really like rhythmic movement or singing or just like really loving touch, being held face to face, like all of that is so important for the child to know like, okay, someone's got me, it's okay, I'm safe, it's going to be all right. And you could really think about it almost as being kind of like a piggy bank or something. Like the timing, the consistency, and the frequency really matter in this relationship. Like the child has to know that every time they cry, that the parent is going to respond. Like every time the child is hungry, the parent is going to feed them. Like there's this like direct correlation between a need arising and the parent really trying their best to rise to the occasion and meet that need. Some really important things about healthy attachment. So this bond is absolutely critical for the child forming their own identity. And there's some really cool, you know, videos on YouTube and that type of thing of like, you know, parents sitting face to face and the parent like having an expression and the child mirroring that, or like vice versa. And these just really cool interactions that just happen from that face-to-face contact between a parent and child. It's super important too for that kid to be able to develop those emotional regulation skills. Obviously an infant isn't going to have those, but as kids grow and develop, they're able to develop those skills for self-soothing and emotional regulation. And I think the most important thing of all is that this early attachment provides a template for future healthy relationships. And there's a really interesting book, I think people are talking about it a lot lately, on just how it's called Attached, and it's about how we as adults really show up in our relationships based on our early attachment with our parents. So some really kind of, I don't know, sad news in some ways in terms of how development can be disrupted in abusive in relationships. So toxic stress really impacts the brain and the brain's ability to form those healthy bonds. Sometimes there will be direct harm between the parent and the child with that attachment bond. Often the adult caregiver can have a really hard time due to their own high levels of stress. And so it's difficult for them to connect and attune to the child's needs. It can come in terms of really impeding the parent's ability to provide the basic needs for her kid, undermining her ability to parent. Some different things just in terms of what might happen in the child's perspective based on the domestic violence. So the child might experience some kind of identity role confusion, kind of not knowing what their role is in the relationship. And then often there can be some really dysfunctional roles that come about. Perhaps a child kind of becomes like a scapegoat, like they're blamed for the family's problems. They might become more of a caretaker and care for the parent who's experienced the abuse. They may be a referee and try and like kind of intervene when the abuse is happening. This can also come in terms of like the kid really having a hard time problem solving or communicating. And overall, it just really impacts, their own sense of safety, power, autonomy, security, just really their ability to kind of navigate relationships elsewhere in the world. So some common myths about abuse. So some people might think that abuse is caused by emotional problems or by substance abuse. I think a really hard thing is that there's a book called Why Does He Do That? Called Lundy Bancroft. And Lundy is just really known to be an expert on working with abusers. That's kind of where he's dedicated his life in trying to work with abusers and help them kind of overcome that tendency to abuse. So what he spends like an entire chapter in his book is just talking about how, alcohol is not to blame, and it comes from an abuser's need to be in control and having power in relationships. And often they may blame it on having emotional problems, or they may also use substances, but those things are not really to be blamed for all. It comes more from like this really powerful need to be in power and control in relationships. A little bit more just about the abusive parent. Often it really looks like an inability to accept responsibility. And so there's a lot of accusing and victim blaming, undermining parenting. I'm just going to kind of skip through some of this because I'm realizing like I'm running a little short on time. You'll be sent all of these slides, so there's you can refer back to them later on. And then here's the section just on what can help in these situations. So I wanted to just give a quick homage to the ACEs study. It's fabulous. If you are not aware of it, it's really, really good research. Basically, it was a really, really high sample study. They took 17,000 participants and they looked at how many adverse childhood experiences these adult people had experienced. And these were some of the different categories of ACEs, or adverse childhood experiences. And what they found was basically the more ACEs that they had experienced, the more likely it was that they had negative health outcomes. These are some of the health outcomes that they saw. So it could include substance use issues, suicide attempts, cancer, heart disease, different issues with STDs and that type of thing. So you can really see too how there's this kind of terrible impact in terms of like experiencing trauma, like that's bad enough in and of itself, but then there's kind of this like secondary issue where it also leads to poor health or early death in some cases. A little bit about this intersection between domestic violence and ACEs. So more than 1/3 of children exposed to domestic violence most likely have 4 other ACEs in addition to that ACE. So the statistics are, I think, really sad in a lot of ways. So I wanted to just get to some important pieces just in terms of how that can affect you guys all as educators. So I think the most important piece to think is that the more healthy, positive relationships a child has, the more resilient they become. So it's like the ACEs study, sure, that's like the bad news in this case, but there's also a lot of power that we as adults who work with children have, and that we can be also a very stable, supportive, positive role in their lives to help mitigate some of the effects of toxic stress. So a little bit just about trauma-informed practice. So it's all about connection and safety. So that was kind of my thought behind having the mindfulness. So teacher regulation really has to come before student regulation. So really think about employing your own strategies for self-regulation before introducing them to other people. Predictability also is so key. So really trying for there to be no surprises for students. So having a really clear, well-defined standard for behavior, or even just for expectations for coursework and homework and that types of things. So talk about these things ahead of time so you won't have to meet them in the moment when people might be more agitated or less emotionally regulated. Anything that's like uncertain or inconsistent really makes it hard for kids to self-regulate. The other piece too I wanted to just talk about was just the need for people to be well fed and hydrated and having enough sleep. Like it's so important for self-regulation and emotional regulation to have all of those basic needs met. So we really we can't ignore the need for all of that. A little bit more on self-regulation. I think these are really good ideas just to really support students and using fidgets, being able to do breathing exercises, do a little bit of yoga, sing, move, be able to eat or drink, do art, maybe doodle during class, just really allowing a space for these things to be used so that students can focus and stay on task and do their coursework. So you could think about our nervous system also as perhaps needing some upregulation at times. So that's like increasing our energy if we're feeling maybe a bit of lethargy, or on the other hand, down regulation, or like helping ourselves calm down if we're feeling a little bit heightened. And then these are some good ideas for how you could help people do those things depending on their needs. And then here's just a really good section on emotional regulation. And I think it's just important to know that, in order for us to be able to regulate our emotions, we really must first be able to name and identify them, know kind of this within the wilderness of our body, when we have these different sensations, what does that mean? Like thinking of kind of like a constellation in the sky. Like if you look at the sky, you might be like, wow, there's a lot of stars, but until you kind of know constellations and be able to pick out like, oh, there's Orion's belt over there. Like, until we can kind of do that within our bodies of being able to connect the sensations to know what emotion we're feeling, it's going to be really difficult for us to be able to regulate our emotions. So these are just a little bit more ideas on like that basic kind of psychoeducation, and then what to do with our emotions once we know they're there. Lastly, I just wanted to give some ideas for additional reading. These all are just really fantastic books that I love so much. And the last one is Addison Duane. She has a really amazing social media presence, and she's all about trauma-informed schools, trauma-informed education. So she's a really great resource. She has more stuff on her website right there as well. And then lastly, I just wanted to offer a space. I'm so sorry. I think I took a little bit longer than I meant to. So we've got about 3 minutes left to just open it up for any questions that you might have. And then here's some more information just about if you need to contact us at the WCA. And then that link has our specific references that were from the presentation throughout. So anyway, thank you so much for being here, and let me know if you have any questions, and we'll be here for the next little bit.